Hello, it's Dan Bunker here from United Learning's EdTech team, and I just want to talk you through a Year 6 project on the Teach Computing curriculum, and that's the one to do with the microbit and introducing variables into programming. So in this Year 6 project, we're going to program our microbit to simulate a coin toss. So when we shake the microbit, we'll get either a heads or a tails, and then when we press button A, we want it to tell us how many times heads has come up, and when we press button B, we want to count the number of tails. Okay, so I need two variables here, and that's the count of the heads and the count of the tails. So I'm going to go to my variables and make a new variable, and the first one is going to be called heads count. Click OK, and I'm going to use my starting count at 0, because when we start there aren't any heads or tails yet. So I'm going to drag that out and put that in my starting condition. I'm now going to create the second variable, and that's going to be the tails count. And in just the same way, when we start off, we want to set the tails to 0. So I've got my two variables created there, and they're set to 0 when the program starts. Now, the basic input for this is the shaking of the microbit. So I'm going to go to my inputs and drag out an on shake block. Now, rather than just go straight to heads or tails, we'll just kind of have a little countdown by showing, a couple of different sort of icons as it counts down. So we'll perhaps have a cross there, and then just another little icon just before we end up with the heads or tails icons we're going to use. Once we've got the countdown, we need a little bit of maths to help us choose the random heads or tails. So if I go into the maths section, there's a pick random true or false, and we want, if it's true, it's going to be a head, and if it's false, it's going to be a tail. So we're going to use this mathematical formula here, and we need to put that into one of the logic blocks, if then else. Okay, so we're going to drag this block and put it into our on shake, and then we're going to ask it to pick a random true or false, and if it's true, we want it to show a kind of a head icon. I'll choose that to be my head, and else if it's not true, then we want the tail. And again, I'll choose just in this case, I'll choose the kind of square for the tails. So here we've got our basic program that when we shake it, it's going to show a cross, a tick, and then it's going to pick either a head or a tail. And what we want to add to our program now is to add to the count of the variables. So every time it chooses a head, we want to add that to the count, and every time it chooses a tail, we want to add that to the count. So if I go to my variables, I'm going to change my heads count by 1 every time it lands on a head, and in the same way I'm going to change my tails count by 1 every time it selects a tail. So we've got our two variables here increasing every time they occur in our random selection. Now, to be able to access the count of those, we need to use the buttons on the microbit. We've got A and B buttons. I'm going to use the input block on button pressed, and I've got two buttons, so I'm just going to duplicate that, and on button A pressed, and then we also want on button B pressed. And what we want to retrieve when we press those buttons is the current count of heads or tails. So if button A is pressed, what we want to do is to show a number. So I'm going to drag out show a number, but instead of it just being a random number here, we want it to be the count from the variables. So the first one is going to be heads, so when I press button A, it'll give me the heads count, and on button B, it's going to be the other variable, it's going to be our tails count. So here we've got our two variables set, heads and tails. We've got a random choice being made, and then the variable increasing by 1 every time it's selected, and when we press the buttons A or B, it'll give us either the heads or the tails count. So that's just a simple program really using the microbit to show how you can use variables in programming. And the final thing I'm going to show is just how we can then send this program to the microbit. If I click on the download on the left hand side, you can pair your device to make it a little bit easier, and that's what I've done here. When I click on download, the program will be sent to the microbit and we can test it on there. But it's also perfectly possible to test it just on the emulator as well. So if we shake here, we can see we've got a head, and then do it again, we've got a tail, and so on, a head and another head and a tail. And let's see how many heads we've had, 3, and how many tails have we had, 2. So you can see the program's working, but it's nice to physically download it, and then we'll finish off with a final little test on the microbit itself. I've now downloaded the program to the microbit, and if I shake it, you can see my program working here as I simulate this coin toss. There's my head, there's a tail, and as we go along, we remember we've set the variables so the counting is recorded. So if I press A, we can see we've had 5 heads and we've had 4 tails. So it's a simple selection of variables in our Year 6 Teach Computing curriculum, and I've just shown you how you can use MakeCode to do that and then send it to your microbit for physical testing.